Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Steve Metzer. I'm Senior Planner and ADA Compliance Specialist with DLZ. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of the ADA series that we started a few years ago on a variety of accessibility issues that impacts our clients. While it's been some time since our last webinar, it is good to be back. For those of you who may be interested in learning about other ADA topics, all of our previous webinars are available for review at DLZ's YouTube page, which I'll provide more information about at the end of today's presentation. Some housekeeping items as we begin. For those of you who are using a computer, you may see at the bottom of your screen a couple of important icons. If you're using a mobile device, your controls may be different than what I'm going to describe. First is closed captioning, which will display my speech into visual text if you need that accommodation or in a location that is noisy. You can simply turn it on by pushing the button on and off and toggling back and forth. The second is the Q&A icon. If you have a question you would like me to address at the end, please type it in here. We asked in the webinar invitation for questions to be submitted in advance, and I have attempted to address all of those in the presentation today, but new questions may come up during the presentation. It will help if you want me to refer back to a slide to give me the slide number that your question pertains to, which can be found in the bottom right-hand corner of all the slides. While the webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours, I will stay on past that time to respond to as many questions as I can, and as long as there are still participants online. If we do run out of time or a question comes up after you leave, please feel free to shoot me an email or contact me, and my contact information is on the last screen of the presentation. If you have other icons on your screen like chat or raise hand, I would ask that you not use those, as those will not be monitored today, given the large number of participants today. The webinar is being recorded, and the video will be provided on our YouTube channel, just like all the other presentations that we've given after it's processed. In addition, if you would like a PDF of the presentation slides, I can make those available to anyone that would like it. So please don't feel the need to screenshot slides or do anything else that would have to take some time out of your attention span. If you would like an accessible version or alternate format for today's slides, those can also be provided upon request. So sit back and here we go. My goal today is to review the scoping and technical requirements of the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design for common outdoor recreation facilities, including those shown here on the slide. While there are other types of facilities covered by the standards, given time constraints, I had to make some hard decisions on what to include and the level of detail. The items I selected for this webinar are those that I believe to be the most commonly found on sites with outdoor recreation activities, or at least common enough to discuss today. I will, for many of the facilities, also include some discussion and examples of the most common issues that we have found during our field compliance investigations, typically as part of an ADA transition plan project. And if you are one of our current or past clients and some of your photographs show up in here, your secret's safe with me, nobody knows where they are. A few more items to pass along. Please note that nothing presented should be interpreted as legal advice or binding advice or binding interpretation of the ADA standards. That's something that we all need to leave up to the regulatory agencies and the courts. However, I am providing my opinion and interpretation based on over 15 years of work in this field. As noted on the previous slide, no discussion for some of the less common recreation facilities is included, such as recreation, boating, amusement rides, golf or miniature golf, and others, which does not minimize the importance of access to those facilities as well, but we do have time constraints. Since each location and conditions at locations vary, the information presented may not fully apply to all situations or any particular situation of one of your locations. No other requirements that may apply are included, including any state or local accessibility requirements, other than maybe a few instances where I will mention the ICC A117 accessibility code and the sections of the ABA standards that have been adapted, sections 1011 through 1019 for some of the specialized recreation facilities. Interpretation of the 2010 ADA standards does differ on some aspects, so any questions with potential legal repercussions really should be directed to the U.S. Department of Justice technical assistance staff. Since our goal should always be to maximize accessibility and opportunities for everyone, I may suggest exceeding, or at least considering to exceed, the minimum requirements at many of the amenities that we'll discuss today, especially where the effort and cost involved is minimal for a large benefit. Lastly, nothing will be presented that pertains to either indoor facilities or items not unique to recreation. Things such as restrooms, parking, some accessible routes, and similar items through chapters 4 and 9 of the ADA standards are common at both indoor and outdoor facilities, but we'll only be covering those things that are unique to outdoors. Accessibility is important at those items as well, but with the time constraint, I would direct you to either forward a question if you have a specific one, or again, look at our YouTube channel and see one of the previous discussions that was given on those ADA standard sections. As we begin, I think it's important that we need to start with a quick review of the technical requirements of the building blocks within Chapter 3 of the ADA standards. These building blocks are referenced and required for a large number of the items that I'll be covering today, and you need to have at least a basic understanding of what all these mean when I say that we have a reach range or a clear space required at an item. The first building block is found in 302 of the ADA standards for floor and ground surfaces. All floor and ground surfaces are required to be stable, firm, and slip resistant. That would typically include most common construction materials you would find outdoors, like concrete, brick pavers, and asphalt, with some other surfaces like compacted stone and wood sometimes being compliant, though you may need a surface treatment to improve the stability or slip resistance. Grass, gravel, sand, dirt, and many other natural surfaces would rarely meet these requirements. Also note there is an exception that's really important for today. While a compliant surface accessible route is required to the border of areas of sport activity, the surfacing within those areas is exempt. Obviously, providing a firm surface on many areas of sporting activity would not be appropriate for things like ball diamonds and soccer fields. But for others like basketball courts, tennis courts, and pickleball, those are already played on an accessible surface and would have that accessibility on the area of sport activity. Many areas of sport activity are also exempt from most of the other building block requirements that follow. 302.3 includes requirements for openings in those ground surfaces along accessible routes, which cannot have separations or openings of more than 1/2 inch. Things like joint separations in concrete, cracking, and utility covers are the most common items that violate this requirement and can cause issues for mobility device users especially. 303 provides the requirements for level changes, which are allowed to be up to 1/4 inch maximum if that change is vertical and can be up to 1/2 inch if it is beveled. Elevation changes over 1/2 inch must be ramped and can often be made compliant by grinding a smooth transition. While you can get changes in level at any location along an accessible route, they tend to be most common where you transition from one material to another, like from concrete to brick or asphalt. Vertical changes in level can not only be a barrier to wheelchair users, but also be a trip hazard to anyone, including persons that are ambulatory, whether they use a mobility aid or not. 304 includes requirements for turning spaces, which permit especially a wheelchair user to perform changes in direction at various site features. You need to provide either a 60-inch diameter circle or a compliant T-shaped turning space for wheelchairs. If you have ever reviewed architectural plans, you often see this type of circle in especially smaller rooms like family restrooms to demonstrate that there is a turning space provided. The new ICC building code is going to include a requirement for new construction that increases the diameter to 67 inches. This is being done to accommodate scooters, which are much more commonly used now than wheelchairs, as has been done in the past. And scooters can often have a very difficult time maneuvering within a 60-inch diameter circle. Existing facilities will be allowed to maintain that 60-inch diameter, but consideration should always be given to trying to maximize access wherever possible for alterations. 305 covers clear spaces, which are required at amenities at nearly every recreation facility to be discussed later, and are essential for amenities to be accessed or reached. Clear spaces are typically 30 inches by 48 inches, but in some locations may be required to be larger, and those will be discussed where applicable. Clear spaces may be required to be either for a forward or parallel approach, depending on what the feature requires or allows. All clear spaces must be directly connected to a compliant accessible route or circulation area, which includes the earlier building block requirement for surfacing and other aspects of accessible routes that are coming up. 306 covers both knee and toe clearance. Let's start first with toe clearance, which is found in 306.2. Without going into too much detail, toe clearance is typically 9 inches high minimum above the ground for a minimum depth of 6 inches. The depth requirement is 17 to 25 inches and it requires a width of 30 inches. These clearances allow a person in a wheelchair to be able to pull up and use an amenity. You will note that this is one instance where more is not always better, as if you provide a device that is too deep, and in this case over 25 inches deep, the knee and toe space depth may not allow for the operable parts to be within reach ranges. Knee clearance, which is found in 306.3, mirrors many of the same requirements as toe space, but also includes a minimum knee space height of 8 inch or depth of 8 inches at 27 inches high and 11 inches minimum depth at 9 inches high. These dimensions all create this odd-shaped polygon you see in the figure on the bottom left. Again, we see the maximum depth restriction to ensure users can reach operable parts. This restriction often precludes deep sinks like those found at hospitals from being compliant. While the knee and toe space below can be expansive, they are often so deep that it is difficult for a person in a wheelchair to reach the faucet controls. 307 covers protruding objects. Any objects by definition that protrudes more than 4 inches between 27 inches and 80 inches is considered a protruding object and a potential hazard, particularly to persons with vision loss. The requirement is not only along the accessible route, but also within all circulation areas of a site. Some of the most common protruding objects at outdoor facilities include hanging flower baskets, drinking fountains, vegetation overhanging a sidewalk, and similar types of items. There are separate requirements for post-mounted objects like those found on a sign pole, which are allowed to be up to 12 inches of protrusion. Post-mounted protrusions are much more common outdoors than indoors, but also much more so in the right-of-way than on park sites. Vertical clearance in all locations is required to be a minimum of 80 inches high. Objects like open staircases or bleachers that are not protected underneath can be a significant hazard if there is no cane detectable barrier to protect the open sides. Fortunately, adding something as simple as a railing or other cane detectable barrier or object to protect that protruding objects or those that lack the minimum vertical clearance is typically fairly easy and low cost. 308 covers reach ranges, which apply to a variety of features on all sites and can be either for a forward reach or a side reach, again, depending on the situation and how the item would normally be expected to be used. Let's start first with unobstructed forward reach, which means the item to be reached can be approached from the front and there is no obstruction to reach over or restrict access. The required reach range has both a lower and upper limit at 15 to 48 inches. Objects that may be reached for in this manner could include things like trash receptacles, waste bag dispensers, light switches, or electrical outlets, and similar types of amenities. If there is some type of obstruction, as shown in the bottom figures, the upper limit of the reach can be up to 20 inches deep over a shelf or countertop and not impact that 48 inches high maximum allowed for an unobstructed reach. However, when that reach is over 20 inches up to 25 inches deep, that maximum height is reduced to 44 inches high to account for the obstruction. These obstructed reach ranges could also be over a lawn area to amenity in the grass, with the distance being measured from the edge of the compliant surface to the amenity. You should not place items at obstructed reach locations under the obstruction, as they would not be accessible at all due to that obstruction. And again, items requiring forward reach over 25 inches deep are not accessible at any height. Some items may be accessed with a side reach, which has the same 15 to 48 inch height for unobstructed reach, but the side reach over an obstruction that can be up to 34 inches high and up to 10 inches deep, again, does not change that maximum 48 inch reach range. However, as that obstruction starts to increase, being over 10 inches wide and up to 24 inches deep, the maximum reach range permitted is only 46 inches. Items requiring a side reach cannot be placed at locations with over a 24-inch deep reach. Here's a good example from a recent evaluation I did. It's pretty common. This apartment complex allows pets and has many trash receptacles and dog waste dispensers on the site, all at the same location. But many of them are not usable since they are located in grass areas, which is not a compliant surface as we talked about earlier, not being firm, stable, and slip resistant. While the trash can height meets the requirements for reach range height, the bag dispenser operable part is at 50 inches high. Both the dispenser and the trash that are located on that same post are over 42 inches away from the sidewalk, which exceeds the 24-inch maximum for side reach from the sidewalk. A person in a wheelchair with a dog or even a service animal would not be able to access either the dispenser or the trash can in this location. There really is no reason why these items should not be corrected by moving that post to be within 24 inches of the sidewalk and also lower that dispenser to be at 48-inch maximum height if it reaches the unobstructed criteria, or 46 inches if it does not. The last building block of Chapter 3 is Section 309, which includes requirements for operable parts. The requirement for operable parts of amenities is that they cannot require complex hand movements and must be operable with one hand. Complex hand movements are generally defined as performing multiple actions with that same hand, such as grasping and twisting, or grasping and pulling or lifting. Perhaps the best test of compliance of operable parts is to try to operate the item with a closed fist. This would simulate someone with an upper body mobility issue like arthritis or something similar, trying to operate that part. In addition to the type of operation required, the force required to operate a part cannot exceed 5 pounds. The most common operable parts issues are with round doorknobs and faucet controls that require grasping and twisting, or vending machine controls that require tight grasping and pulling of a knob to dispense product. For outdoor recreation facilities, one of the most common non-compliant operable parts that we see are latches at gates to aquatic facilities, whether to the perimeter of a pool or to a child's wading pool area. The required grasping and lifting operation violates the requirements of 309 for operable parts in most cases. This can usually easily be fixed by switching out the knob or by adding a small bar or lever that can be lifted with a closed fist. So as noted, all these building blocks are going to be referenced throughout today's webinar, and I will not be restating the technical requirements in most cases except where they are increased or varying for that specific item. So now let's move on to our main topic for today. Similar to the building blocks, accessible routes have several scoping provisions on outdoor recreation sites that are provided in the ADA standards. First, 206.2 requires that there be at least one accessible route within a site from accessible parking spaces, public streets and sidewalks, and public transportation stops. So if your park borders a public sidewalk, you need to be sure that you provide a connection to that sidewalk into the park. That accessible route cannot include steps or other non-accessible route like this tennis court. In addition, at least one of each item on all sites must be also connected to an accessible route, and often more than one is required to be on an accessible route. And I'll talk about each one of those on a case-by-case basis. One of the most common issues we see on park sites is non-compliance with 206.2.12, which requires at least one accessible route be directly connected to both sides of the court for court sports like basketball, tennis, and pickleball, and also a lack of accessible routes to many sport field perimeters. Here's a good example of a smaller park that provides all the required accessible routes. This site includes the community center with parking lot and connection from the parking and the community center to the right-of-way sidewalk, perimeter walking path and benches, play area, and boundary of both the tennis courts and the one basketball court on the site. Here's another not so good example of a much smaller park that provides none of the required connections other than the short interior path to the right-of-way sidewalks that bisects this park. There is no connection to the boundary of either one of the two play areas, the covered picnic shelter, the benches near those play areas where a parent would sit and watch their children play, or the drinking fountain on the site. As I mentioned briefly earlier, another common situation where there's often no accessible routes to sport fields are soccer fields. And you can see at this complex what we have laid out. Imagine the difficulty of not only providing a compliant accessible route to the perimeter of each one of these fields from the parking lot, or maybe even both sides, but what if this park was also used for football or lacrosse or other field sport, and those other sport fields were oriented differently or perpendicular even to the youth soccer fields? You can't tell from the aerial, but at the area of the red line on the photograph, there's quite a steep hill that has about 8 to 10 feet of vertical elevation difference that you need to climb to get to those 5 larger fields from the parking lot. That is not nearly a compliant slope and needs to provide a compliant ramp when the accessible routes are added at some point in the future. Walking surfaces of accessible routes need to be a compliant surface, if you remember the firm, stable, slip resistant building block, and has limits for running slope of 5% maximum, cross slope of 2.1% maximum, with no level changes, have a minimum clear width of 36 inches, and a passing space that's 60 inches wide every 200 feet. There is an allowance at some obstructions to narrow the accessible route to 32 inches in width, but only for a 4-foot distance. The new building code is going to include a requirement for 48 inches of width for accessible routes for new construction. We're not quite sure yet if that's going to apply to exterior sites, but I assume it will, so continue to watch for more information to come on that issue, and when it is published, I will certainly pass that along. Okay, let's get to the first specific type of recreation facility, and one that is found in some way at nearly every park: play areas. The ADA standards require in 206.2.17 that play areas comply not only with all provisions of Chapter 4 for accessible routes, including all the slopes and surfacing and level changes that I've covered in the building blocks, but also that at least one accessible route be provided to the boundary of and within the play area. Within the play area, that accessible route is required to connect all of the various play components, including the entry and exit points of those play components. So you need to connect to the ladders of the slide, the end of the slide, the swings, all the other play components that we'll be talking about here coming up. That connection can be either ramped or not, but surely cannot be like either of the locations with grass around the entire perimeter shown on the bottom left and middle photographs. There are some modifications to the accessible route required by 1008.2, including 1008.2.4.1, which requires that within a play area, the ground level accessible route is required to be 60 inches in width to provide that turning space building block. So if you think about a child that would travel from one play amenity to maybe a swing, if you don't provide a 60-inch width, that person may not be able to utilize the ability to turn and go to another play component. So that's why the 60-inch width is required within the play area. As we dive deeper into play areas, I want to ensure that we're all on the same page related to a couple of the common terms. First is play component, which is simply just that, something used for play, socialization, or learning, and which can be either manufactured or natural, standalone, or part of a play structure. Play components don't include some of the construction features like the transfer system or steps or decks or roofs or ramps or bridges or anything structural in most cases. A ground play element or ground level play component is a play component that is both approached and exited at the ground level. Elevated play components are approached either at or above grade and are part of a larger play structure that consists of 2 or more play components. So the slides that follow will hopefully clarify those differences and make it a little bit more apparent of what qualifies as either a ground or an elevated play component. Within the play area, there are also often a number of use zones, which is the ground level area beneath and immediately adjacent to a structure or play equipment that is designed for circulation around that equipment and where it is predicted that a user would land if they were to fall or exit from the play equipment. These use zones typically are required to provide a surface that protects anyone that may fall and also often be an accessible surface. So just a quick comparison of a similar type of climbing play item, with the one on the left being a ground play element since it is both accessed and exited from the ground level and not part of a play structure. The climber on the right is part of a play structure and is either accessed or exited from the structure depending on where you start and end, not the ground level, making it an elevated play item. Both are climbing type play items, but are different play type components, with the one on the left being ground and the one on the right being elevated. Note that play areas designed specifically for children under the age of 2 are mostly exempt from the standards. It's assumed that parents or other adult would assist children of that age, but it certainly is still best practice to try to provide accessible surfaces to the greatest extent possible, even in those exempted areas. The standards apply to each and every separate play area. When evaluating those areas with play equipment, play areas should be considered separate if they are either designed for different age levels or if they are geographically separated on a site and not directly connected in any way. While you can focus your accessibility efforts on one play area at a time, ultimately your goal needs to be full compliance at all play areas. Here's an example of a park with 13 separate and distinct play areas. Not sure what they were thinking when they installed all these, but they have 13 separate distinct play areas at this park. This is a nightmare for evaluation of the compliance since each one of these areas has ground play items. Some have both ground and elevated play items, and several are for different age groups. We strongly recommended that this client consider reconfiguring their park to consolidate the play items into fewer different areas and allow for better compliance with accessibility requirements for the numbers and types at each location. By doing so, they would also open up some open space that they could use for other items at the park for adults and other users of that facility. The ADA standards reference a number of very important standards of the American Society for Testing Materials related to both safety and accessibility. I'm not going to cover those in detail other than to state that they are a requirement and that there are very few surfaces that can meet the requirements for both fall safety by being soft and accessibility by being firm, stable, and slip resistant, as we've talked about. Poured rubber and similar surfaces are pretty common, but if you've ever installed that, you know also that they are very expensive and they do require maintenance. You can see on the top photograph an example of an area with poured rubber that has an area that has already been patched and one that needs to be patched to eliminate surface variations and vertical separations. Engineered wood fiber can meet both requirements and is less expensive than poured rubber, but it requires regular maintenance to maintain accessibility, sometimes as much as weekly or maybe even every couple of days. Surfaces like regular mulch, wood chips, shredded rubber tires, pea gravel, and many others that we see used do not meet one or both of the requirements for either safety or accessibility. To ensure equal opportunities for all abilities, Table 240.2.1.2 includes the requirements for the number and types of ground play elements required to be provided and located on an accessible route, which is based on the total number of elevated play components. This is to ensure that children who might not be able to use a transfer system, or if there's no ramp available, that would still allow them to interact with other children and play at the ground level. You will note that the table includes both the total number of ground components and the number of different types. Let's talk about the types, and while we do that, keep in mind that some of these are going to be either able to be used as ground or elevated, depending on how they are entered and exited, as we talked about earlier with the climber. When talking about the types of element for play, they are typically identified by the experience that the component is designed to provide. Examples include spinning elements, which come in a wide variety of types. One that is almost always provided are swinging components, whether a typical swing set or other types of swings. There are also swings intended for use by a child in a wheelchair, as shown in the left photograph. That front panel folds down and the size of the platform accommodates a child in a wheelchair and allows a parent or guardian to push the child right in their wheelchair on that swing. Slides can be either ground or elevated play, again based on where it is entered and exited from. The type of slide does not matter, so a straight slide or a spiral type slide are both simply slide play element types. All kinds of climbing play items are available and can be either ground level or elevated elements. A variety of rockers are also common, and nearly all of those are ground play elements that can help you meet both your number and type of ground play elements that are required. Another common ground play element type are balancers, which can apply to all age groups, even senior citizens, and can also be elevated on some large structures. Perhaps one of the often overlooked opportunities for play are those elements that are educational and provide sensory, learning, some type of a table or role-playing opportunity. These are also common as both ground and elevated play elements. And there are a wide variety of other types, such as diggers and tunnels and rollers and others. Diggers and rollers are generally ground play, but a tunnel could be either type. It is important to note that regardless of how many and what types of elements you have, at least one of each type of ground play element must be on that compliant accessible route with proper surfacing. For many ground play elements not near a play structure, the surfacing can generally be more accessible and have less concerns about fall safety, but there are some ground play elements where that is still an important consideration. One thing that we're starting to see much more commonly is the use of natural play items, which simulate nature and can be of various types as well, as shown on the slide here, with simulated rocks and logs and rivers. So now that we know the different types of play elements, let's talk a little bit more about how we need to determine the required number and types. We earlier showed table 240.2.1.2, which provides the scoping for the number and types of the various play elements required. So for this fictional play structure, we need to count the types of play elements. We have climbers, slides, and sensory, with 6 total elements and 3 types. So based on the table, since there are no ground play elements attached to this structure, we would need to provide at least 2 ground level play elements of 2 different types, which could easily be met by providing a swing set and a rocker or similar ground play element. Larger play structures get much more complex and can require many more types and total number of ground play level components. There's no such similar table for elevated components. It's simply that 50% of all elevated play components must be on an accessible route if there are less than 20 on the structure, with that route being either ramps or a transfer system of platforms and steps. For our play structure from the previous slide, since there are 6 total play elements, at least 3 must be on the elevated accessible route. And for that example, all of them are, so we meet the requirements. When you get to those really massive play structures that have 20 or more components total, not 20 types, but 20 total elements, you have that same requirement for the elevated accessible route to connect 50% of the total, but that needs to be split to include access to 25% by ramps and up to 25% by transfer or ramps. Ramps are always better. So for the play structure pictured, let's assume there are 24 total elevated play elements. 50% of the 24 are required to be on an accessible route, so 12. Of those 12, a minimum of 6 must be accessible by ramps. The other 6 could be accessible by ramps or by transfer platforms and steps. Essentially, you could have all 12 of them accessed by the ramp to comply if you so choose, but you could not have more or less than 6 of them accessible by ramps. Based on the table, that number of elevated play components would require this play area to provide a total of 8 ground play elements of 4 different types. On these large types of play structures, there's almost always a multiple number of ground play elements on the structure itself, but you can also see that there are some separated swings and slides and some other things that would help you get to that number of 8 elements of 4 different types. I have mentioned both ramps and transfer systems as requirements for access to elevated play elements. Let's now cover the requirements of those fairly quickly. Ramp requirements are pretty straightforward, so I'll cover them first. Ramps connecting to elevated play areas must be 36-inch minimum width, have a slope of 1/12 or 8.33% or less, and cannot have a vertical rise for each run of more than 12 inches. They must provide handrails, and those handrails must be circular and be between 0.95 and 1.55 inches in diameter. And the top of the gripping surface of those handrails above the ramp must be between 20 and 29 inches. Handrail extensions, as required on most ramps within the ADA standards, are not required for play structures. The other type of permissible access are transfer platforms at the ground level and steps above that. Transfer platforms are required by 1008.3.1 to be at least 14 inches deep and 24 inches wide and be 11 to 18 inches above the ground surface. The actual shape of the platform can vary, but it must have the required 14-inch depth and 24-inch width dimensions. Our building block clear space of 30 inches by 48 inches that we talked about earlier must be provided immediately adjacent to the transfer platform and have the 48-inch long section centered on and parallel to the 24-inch transfer platform dimension. There must also be at least one means of support for transferring, which is typically some type of a vertical bar or bars or a D bar. The photo on the bottom left shows the location of a compliant 14 by 24-inch transfer platform on that triangular platform and the adjacent and parallel clear space with transfer support bars that fully complies. The adjacent natural log transfer platform on the right photograph has a compliant size as well at 14 by 24 inches, but it does not have that clear space immediately adjacent to the platform and also does not have the support bars within the reach range for the clear space. So this bottom right natural log transfer platform is not accessible to a child trying to utilize it. Transfer platforms can be a wide variety of configurations and shapes, but all must have compliant clear space dimensions and components. Surprisingly, there are a fair number of play structures that do not provide any transfer platforms and have only steps, which can work, but they're not nearly as accessible as having a platform that leads to steps. Once a child is transferred to that platform from their wheelchair, they need to be able to keep transferring to the play level using the series of steps. Each step is required to be the same size as the transfer platform at 14 inches deep and 24 inches wide. But each step cannot be any higher than 8 inches, and those transfer supports are required as well. Those are typically the vertical bars on the railings, but sometimes they are separated and standalone transfer supports. This photo shows a really good example of a lower transfer platform that meets all the requirements with the larger platform at the change of direction to get from the platform to the steps. All of them have transfer supports, and then as they go up the steps to the upper level, you can also see the railing or handrails that are used for transfer support. There is a requirement for at least one turning space on the same level as accessible play components for elevated play components, which would allow a child in a wheelchair to turn around and get off the structure via the ramp. Where provided, play tables, like the one shown in the photo, must provide knee clearance that is at least 24 inches high, 17 inches deep, and 30 inches wide for a child in the wheelchair to use. If the play table is designed for children that are 5 years of age or younger, it does not have to provide the knee space, but there must be a clear space immediately adjacent to the table. Splash pads are basically ground play equipment with water, with few having anything elevated, but there are some exceptions. If there are elevated components and you have a splash pad, you should evaluate that splash pad in the same manner for the number of required ground and elevated play elements on an accessible route as you would for regular play equipment. Ensure accessible routes are compliant to both the perimeter of the pad and within the spray pad area, but do note that the slip resistant requirement is not required to be met for splash pads. So now that we've smoothly transitioned to the aquatic environment, let's move on to the next type of facility, pools. The scoping requirement for swimming pools are found in 242 and requires at least 2 accessible means of entry be provided for swimming pools with 300 linear feet of perimeter wall. Of those 2 accessible means of entry into the pool, at least one must be either a lift or a sloped entry. So every pool must have at least one of a lift or sloped entry. I'm only today going to discuss of the 5 types of allowable accessible means of entry into pool, the pool lift, the sloped entry, and pool stairs. Since lifts and sloped entries are required as one of the 2 accessible means of entry, and pool stairs are the most common non-lift or sloped entry means of access into a pool. Transfer walls and transfer systems won't be discussed since they are not common, but they are allowable as that second means of entry into a pool if you so choose. And if you have those, you would like to have more questions about that, please feel free to send me an email and some photographs so we can talk about what they do from a compliance standpoint at your location. All wading pools are required to provide access, and that access must be via a sloped entry. Wading pools are typically provided for use by toddlers and small children and have limited water depth. There are some special pools which are exempt or have different access requirements. Pools like wave action pools, leisure rivers, sand bottom pools, and others that have limited access at only one location are not required to provide more than one accessible means of entry. That accessible means of entry must be either a lift, a sloped entry, or a transfer system. Most commonly, we see sloped entries. Catch pools, which are defined as a pool or section of pool that is at the end of a water slide, are not required to provide an accessible means of entry, but that catch pool edge must be located along an accessible route. While not specifically mentioned in the standards, I think that same logic holds true for diving pools. Since the use is entered above the ground level and the pool is entered from above the pool deck, it seems appropriate that diving pools would also be exempt, but would also be required to be on an accessible route. So let's discuss pool lifts, which are designed to allow a person that uses a wheelchair to transfer from that wheelchair to the lift seat, use controls to swing themselves over the pool and into the water, where the seat remains until they're done swimming. Once they're done, they swim back up to the seat, get on, and use those same controls to lift themselves out of the water to their wheelchair, where they then transfer again. There are many different configurations of pool lifts, but all have the same minimum requirements. Pool lifts must be located on the perimeter of the pool, where the pool level does not exceed 48 inches of depth, unless the entire pool exceeds 48 inches of depth, and then it would be allowed to be anywhere. If more than one lift is provided, only one of those lifts need to be located at the 48-inch maximum water depth. And it is strongly encouraged that if you have multiple types of entry required, that you diversify. Just because two means of entry are required into a pool, and both could be lifts, lifts do not necessarily work for all different types of disabilities and swimmers with disabilities that might want to enter the water. We and the Access Board certainly recommend that you consider multiple types. The seat is required in the raised position to have the center line located over the deck and be at least 16 inches from the edge of the pool. On the side of the seat opposite the water, a clear space is required that exceeds our normal clear space. This one is required to be 36 by 48 instead of 30 by 48. And that clear space needs to be parallel with the seat, with the 48-inch side of the clear space beginning from a line located 12 inches behind the rear edge of the seat. This is the typical type of transfer arrangement that someone in a wheelchair would have, that's also found at transfer showers inside of buildings. The clear space on this side of the seat is required to have a slope no steeper than 2.1%. The seat's required to be 16 to 19 inches above the pool deck, again, to accommodate that transfer from the wheelchair to the pool seat, and the seat is required to be at least 16 inches wide. All pool lifts are required to provide footrests, and those footrests must move with the seat. Armrests can either be provided, but they are not required. But if you do provide them, the armrest opposite the water side must either be removable or fold up to be clear of the seat to allow that person in the wheelchair to transfer over from their wheelchair to the seat. A very important requirement is that the lift must be able to be operated without assistance from both the deck and the water side. The controls need to move with the seat and have compliant operable parts. Pool lifts should be permanently mounted to the pool deck and be available at all times that the pool is open. Having a portable lift unit in storage that is wheeled out only when someone wants to use it or upon request, or having a lift that you need someone to operate is not permitted. All lifts must provide a minimum of 18 inches of submerged depth within the water from the top of the seat to allow the person on the seat to get into the water without having to lean over and jump or splash out, and also be capable of handling a capacity of at least 300 pounds. While pool lifts have greatly improved over the years, they really are the best and maybe only way for someone in a wheelchair to access a pool, other than what I'm going to talk about next with certain circumstances. That second option you have for one of the two primary responsible or accessible means of entry into a pool is use of a sloped entry. 1009.3.1 includes the requirements for sloped entries, which are basically underwater ramps. Sloped entries must have a slope not exceeding 8.33% and cross slope not exceeding 2.1%. There is a requirement for that bottom level landing to extend to a depth of 24 to 30 inches below the water level. You are allowed to have additional landings, but you must have one landing at the bottom of your ramp runs in the sloped entry at 24 to 30 inches of depth. For wading pools, as we talked about earlier, The sloped entry and landings are required to extend to the deepest part of that wading pool. Sloped entries are required to provide handrails on both sides, and they must have a clear width between them of 33 to 38 inches and a height to the gripping surface of 34 to 38 inches above the pool bottom. No handrail extensions are required at the bottom landing, but they are required to be 12 inches at the top and parallel with the ground surface. It's important to note that wading pools do not require handrails. Since most personal wheelchairs and mobility devices are not appropriate typically for being submerged in water, you can increase accessibility by providing an aquatic wheelchair, which are made of a non-corrosive material and designed for access into water. Again, this is not required, but if you do not provide a lift, you might want to consider purchasing an aquatic wheelchair for use in combination with your sloped entry. I looked online and have found a variety of different types that range in cost from under $1,000 to several $1,000s, depending on the style and type. As I mentioned earlier, the most common second means of accessible entry into a pool that's not a lift or a ramp is pool stairs. Pool stairs are usable only by ambulatory persons, and most pools have many sets of stairs that can also be used by swimmers with a mobility impairment, even though they do not meet the requirements I'm going to cover now. Accessible pool stairs have specific requirements for the riser height, nosing radius, and angle. I'm not going to discuss in great detail, other than to say that if you're considering purchasing a set of portable pool stairs, be certain that they comply. We do see these types of pool stairs being purchased that often exceed the 30-inch maximum angled riser, which would be very difficult for some ambulatory disabled users to utilize. Accessible pool stairs are required to provide handrails on both sides, and those handrails must have a clear width between them of 20 to 24 inches. Similar to sloped entries, extensions are not required at the bottom, only at the top, and must meet that same 12-inch length and be parallel to the deck surface as the handrails on the sloped entry. The pool stairs in this photo on the right is the one that I showed earlier, and do have excessive angles on the stairs. In addition, the handrails were much greater than 24 inches apart, which basically makes them unusable for a number of disabled swimmers. Pool access can be provided pretty easily if you currently have an issue of non-compliance by purchasing and installing a compliant lift, and if necessary, a set of removable pool stairs can easily solve accessibility issues even if you currently have no means of accessible entry. The next feature to discuss are picnic areas, which I'm going to lump together to include picnic shelters and all the items that are typically included, such as picnic tables, grills, water sources, and other items. Let's start first with picnic tables, which are a dining surface under 902. Dining surfaces must provide a clear space for front approach and knee and toe space beneath, with the top of the dining surface being 24 to 34 inches high, or 28 to 34 inches high, excuse me. While picnic tables on park sites are often scattered all over, those that are located in lawn areas are not on an accessible route. So to provide both the required 30-inch width and knee and toe space below, picnic table manufacturers have come up with a wide variety of types and styles. Some, like the one on the bottom left, are not accessible in any way. The clear space on the end is 30 inches wide, but there is not enough knee and toe space below to even provide a wheelchair space on the end of that model. The two on the bottom right have short extensions that provide an accessible space on the end, not on the side next to the bench, but on the end, with the upper right table having two spaces and maybe even three with that clear space on both sides and the end with compliant knee and toe space below. So choose your model wisely as you determine how many compliant wheelchair spaces you need at your picnic shelters. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Some tables have no clear space or space below them unless one of the benches is left off. These square style tables provide no opportunity for a wheelchair space unless the one bench is omitted, which is offered from manufacturers for most models as shown. Determination of the number of required accessible spaces does get tricky, however. To determine the number of accessible spaces required, you need to measure the perimeter of the usable area of all tables at a shelter. 1011.4 requires one accessible space for every 24 feet of usable table area perimeter. Usable would be determined by how the tables are arranged and based not on your failure to place them with a compliant approach or clear space, but rather how they are usable by everyone. So let's do some quick math. On this pool deck dining shelter on the right, there are 6 square tables with 4-foot sides, giving us 16 feet of usable perimeter per table and a total usable perimeter at these tables of 96 feet. With the requirement of one wheelchair space for every 24 feet of perimeter, this shelter would need to provide at least 4 accessible spaces, but only one is provided. You can see here and from the next example the importance of assuring that once you have determined how many accessible seats you need, that you purchase a truly accessible table. Let's look at another that might be more common with rectangular picnic tables. It might be difficult to see entirely with the shade under the shelter at the time that I took the photograph, so you'll have to just trust my numbers. This shelter provides a total of 19 tables. There are 3 rows of 6 rectangular tables that are 6 feet long. Since the ends of the tables are butted against each other, only the end tables on each row provides a usable perimeter at that end. So if you add up all 3 rows with 2 ends and 6 tables, we have 78 feet of usable perimeter times 3. Plus we have a single 10-foot table with 3-foot ends that is accessible, adding 26 feet, giving us a total of 260 perimeter feet within this shelter for usable perimeter of picnic tables. Dividing that 260 by 24 gives us a requirement for 10.8 accessible spaces, which is rounded up to 11. This shelter only provides 4 of the 11. 2 of them on the end on the left and the one in the middle row, and 2 spaces at the end of the 10-foot table. There is no accessible route to the far side ends, and there's not enough room between the tables to get any other accessible spaces. So this demonstrates the fact that the presence and number of accessible wheelchair spaces is often an issue at picnic shelters. I wanted to use that last example to demonstrate what I see as one of the most common errors made, trying to cram in too many tables within a shelter. In shelters that have good circulation spaces and most ends have an approachable clear space with knee and toe space, it's much easier to meet the requirements than it may seem. You really need to consider the style of tables you have, ensure the ends meet knee and toe space requirements, and proceed from there. Ensure the placement, orientation, and configuration of your picnic tables can meet the needs for your disabled users. Ensure that once you have determined how many accessible seats you need, that you purchase a table that can help meet those requirements. All your good work to provide accessibility can easily be undone if tables are not secured in place and users can move them around, and I know many clients that have this problem. I realize that many of you also have some very high use pavilions and you may need that quantity of seating, but as you can see, it isn't without potential repercussions. I often suggest and would suggest to many of you today that you evaluate your shelters and publicize which ones provide accessible spaces and the number of accessible spaces to be proactive in letting your public know which shelters may meet their needs when they rent those facilities if you allow them to be rented. You might also want to think about including information about their needs on applications so that your staff can customize the layout based on their known need for wheelchair spaces. I could go over dozens and dozens of layouts and calculations, but obviously we don't have time for that. You need to ensure that compliant accessible routes are provided to all your shelters and those amenities within the shelter. Most important would be a route to the perimeter access point from parking or interior routes. This is a priority over having accessible picnic tables at the shelter, since that doesn't matter if someone in a wheelchair cannot even get to the shelter as circled in the photograph in this slide. If you do have a route to the perimeter of the shelter, ensure that you have access into it as well. Having a step or other vertical change is a barrier and a higher priority to correct again than having the picnic tables within be accessible. If you do have both a route to the perimeter and into the shelter, you need next to ensure that you have a compliant route within. Those routes need to be 36-inch width minimum, with that allowance around an obstruction that can be reduced for 32 inches for a 48-inch depth. The shelter from our math exercise earlier has no accessible routes within the shelter other than at the entry point, which made the ends on the far side inaccessible, and they lost 3 wheelchair spaces immediately because of that. Grills are a common item found both as a standalone amenity and also very commonly associated with shelters. 1011.5 covers not only grills but also fire rings, fireplaces, and wood stoves, but I'm only going to discuss grills today. Grills are required to provide a 48-inch wide clear space centered on the grill. You can see on the figure that it shows 48 inches around all sides, but this is more applicable to other features like a fire ring where the use is around the entire object. A grill has a functional area really only at the front. The cooking surface needs to be between 15 and 34 inches high. It is best to provide that level 2.1% or less slope space at the grill as well, though the figure from the access board guide shows higher slopes, and I'm not sure if that is an error or is just a remnant from previous allowances. Grills are often on a pad directly connected to a shelter, but often, almost always, not underneath the cover of the shelter for safety reasons. Ensure, if that is the case, that there's an accessible route from the entry point of the shelter to the grill through the shelter between all those picnic tables. If there's not a grill pad connected to the shelter, it's often a fairly easy task to add a small area of concrete to make that connection. You just need to ensure that the width is 48 inches minimum, and if there's a drop off on the edge, it might be worth considering something a little wider like 60 inches to allow a wheelchair user of that grill to turn. In locations where the grill is not associated with or near a shelter, evaluate the available options to make your grills, at least some of them, accessible. You really have 2 options. One is providing a compliant accessible route and clear space at those grills over time as you make improvements to the park, though there are a lot of grills we see that are quite distant from an accessible route and are going to be really expensive to tie in. Another, and maybe better option in some cases, is simply moving some grills to a different location to be closer or adjacent to an existing accessible route and provide a pad with the required clear space that connects to the grill from that accessible route. In the photo on this slide, you can see there are 3 grills at this location with several picnic tables, none of which have a compliant accessible route to them or clear space, but they're really close to that perimeter path at the bottom of the photograph. By adding a pad without moving the grill, they could greatly improve conditions. And that pad at this location could even be oversized to also allow one of the picnic table ends to be made accessible and provide 1 wheelchair space minimum. Water sources are often provided at shelters. 1011.6 requires water spouts to be 28 to 36 inches above the ground with compliant operable parts and a clear space that is a little bit larger than our normal building block clear space. Admittedly, providing a compliant water source operable part is very difficult, and we rarely see them be compliant, but do the best that you can if they are provided. If a shelter has electricity and lights, you need to ensure that at least one of the light switches and at least one outlet is within the reach range for either an obstructed or unobstructed reach, and that there is a compliant clear space at the switch and outlet. The last item I'm going to talk about for picnic areas are protruding objects. One common item at some older shelters are the angled supports on the posts. These would be protrusions if they are under 80 inches high and beyond the 12 inches allowed for a protrusion of a post-mounted object. You can see one option to eliminate the protrusion on the side used for access with the addition of a permanent cane detectable railing below, and there are other options, but ensure that those are protected. The next item I'm going to talk about are site furnishings, which are in addition to the furnishings discussed earlier. Many parks have a variety of site furnishings, including drinking fountains, benches, trash receptacles, dog waste bag dispensers, and others. If you remember, we already discussed the issues with some reach range items near the beginning in the building block discussion. Many of these types of objects typically require both a clear space adjacent to and a compliant reach height from the accessible route. It's important to be aware of how locating objects impacts other furnishings. This dog waste dispenser is located within both the reach range and height that's required, but it's obstructed by the trash receptacle. Fortunately, it's an easy fix to just simply move that trash receptacle, but it is something that you really need to consider as you lay out your parks and the furnishings. Let's talk first about drinking fountains. While drinking fountains are not required by the ADA standards in any way in any facility, if provided on a site, they must meet all the provisions in scoping and technical standards. The scoping provisions of 211.2 for drinking fountains notes that for an exterior site, if drinking fountains are provided, you must provide one each that meets the requirements for a wheelchair user, which is in 602.1 through 602.6, and one that's compliant for a standing user that complies with 602.7. So if you provide drinking fountains on a site, you must have at least two. They do not have to be at the same location, although they commonly are. The standards don't provide any guidance about travel distance to different types. So if you have a wheelchair fountain and a standing user fountain that are not at the same location, there's no requirement for how close they need to be. But consider the fact that it may not be obvious or convenient for a wheelchair user to travel a long distance, or someone with a lower body mobility impairment that is ambulatory to travel a long distance to the other type of fountain. If you have more than two fountains, 50% of each must meet the requirements of either a wheelchair or standing user fountain. So for example, on a really large site, let's say you had 6 total drinking fountains, 3 would need to meet the requirements for a wheelchair user and 3 for a standing user. Best practice now includes providing bottle fillers as well, which don't substitute for any type of fountain, but they do maximize the opportunities for people who use a water bottle and allows them to reduce the number of trips that they need to make for water. I would urge everyone on this webinar to evaluate the types and locations of all fountains at your parks, as well as the model of fountains that you have. It's all too common for us to find a fountain like the one in the photograph, which provides only a wheelchair fountain and a dog bowl filler, with no other fountain at this site that meets the requirements for a standing user. If you like these post-type fountains, ensure that they provide both the high and low fountain with the dog bowl filler, and they make a lot of types of those. Fortunately, many of them can be simply swapped out using the same hookups and providing both the standing user and the wheelchair accessible heights. Let's quickly go over those technical requirements that are found in 602. The low fountain, or the one used for wheelchairs, must provide a clear floor space for forward approach that provides the knee and toe clearance that we've talked about many times earlier already today, 27-inch minimum knee space. The operable parts must not require more than 5 pounds of force and be able to be used with a closed fist. The spout height for a wheelchair fountain is a maximum of 36 inches high. That spout must be located a minimum of 15 inches from the vertical support and 5-inch maximum from the front edge of the unit, which allows a wheelchair user to reach that water flow but not hit their head against the back wall. The water flow is also required to be a minimum of 4 inches high, again, to allow someone in a wheelchair to reach the water. You might not be able to tell, but this location has only a low fountain on the left and bottle filler on the right, again, with no high fountain provided, and there's no other fountain in this entire park. Unfortunately for this client, this is a pretty typical condition at all their parks, which results in non-compliance at every location that they provide drinking fountains. And they are going to need to replace all of their fountains or add another one to provide both the required low and high fountain at all their sites. The standing user fountain really only requires that the bubbler height be between 38 and 43 inches and the operable parts be compliant. There's no other requirements for toe or knee space or anything else that is required for wheelchair fountains, but it is advisable to consider including at least some additional accommodations like spout depth and water stream height to maximize accessibility. Drinking fountains not located with an alcove and located along circulation areas are often protruding objects, at least on the high fountain side with a cantilevered style fountain. You may only need to protect one side of paired fountains, or as in the case of the fountains in this example, both sides are open and protruding in the photo on the right. The photo on the left was taken during off-season, so the trash cans are currently in the way of the clear space, but those cans are outdoors when the facility is open. While these fountains are contained within an alcove with an overhead door so that it can be closed when the pool is open, this is actually on a pool deck, they are entirely outside of the circulation area. Let's talk briefly about benches. Benches on site require a 36 by 48-inch clear space. Again, this is a little bit oversized from our previous 30 by 48-inch building block that's provided on one side, and that clear space must adjoin a compliant accessible route. The clear space must not encroach on the accessible route to reduce it to less than 36 inches. The clear space adjacent to that bench allows a companion to sit side by side with someone in a wheelchair. There are no technical requirements for benches on sites like there are for changing or dressing rooms, but by providing an armrest and back support, it can be very helpful for persons needing support to stand, or if you provide that open side on the bench, it can allow a person in a wheelchair to transfer from their wheelchair to the bench to sit if they so choose. The best case scenario would be to provide both an open side and an armrest to maximize accessibility on benches on sites. Benches are commonly found at play areas, especially to allow parents to be close and observe children at play at those play structures and play areas that we talked about earlier. And they're also oftentimes located along accessible routes. It's not unusual also to see benches located within lawn areas out in the middle of a lawn area on a park. Many benches don't provide a compliant surface connection or clear space. So consider ensuring that you have at least one of each in each area that provides that clear space. Let's move on to outdoor assembly areas as we're nearing the end. By definitions in the standards, an assembly area is a building or facility used for the purpose of entertainment, educational, or civic gatherings or similar purposes. There's a wide variety of assembly areas inside of buildings, but typically on exterior sites, the most common ones we see are stadiums, amphitheaters, and grandstands. Where an assembly area has permanent seating, there are requirements for wheelchair and companion spaces, with the number required being based on seating capacity of the fixed seating. In addition, assembly areas where audible communication is integral to the use of a space that provides audio amplification, those assembly areas are often required to provide an assistive listening system. Let's first touch very briefly on assistive listening systems at assembly areas. As noted, the standards require an assistive listening system only where audio amplification is provided and audible communication is integral to the use of the space, whatever that means. So here's a question. Would audio amplification at a Little League ball diamond, which meets the definition of assembly area because it has grandstands and is an assembly area, which is used only to announce players' names, require an assistive listening system? Do you think a reasonable person would consider audible communication integral to the use of that type of facility? Personally, I would say probably not, particularly if the use of the PA system is not extensive. And many locations only announce the person batting, but some people may consider that integral. Since most of you do not have large assembly spaces that would require an ALS, I'm just going to leave that there and not discuss it in any more detail since the requirements are pretty easy to read in Table 219.3, using the same seating capacity you would for wheelchair spaces, with the primary difference being that the assistive listening system count requirements are not based solely on the number of fixed seating, but the total seating capacity. If you have specific questions about something on assistive listening systems, send me an email at the end here and we can discuss. As I mentioned, assembly areas with fixed seating are required by 221 to provide both wheelchair spaces and companion seats. Those spaces need to be integrated into the overall seating plan, meaning you can't put them in their own section, the wheelchair seating section. They need to be integrated and not segregated. The number of spaces required can be found in Table 221.2.1.1. For facilities with individual seats or benches with seat identification, the counting of the number of seats is pretty easy. Often bleacher seating doesn't provide seat numbers or the number of rear ends that can fit on a bench. So in those cases, we measure 18 inches and assume that there is one seat for every 18 inches of bench seating on a bleacher. The grandstand pictured provides 54 total seats at this tennis court, which according to the table would require 4 wheelchair spaces with companion seats. There are 4 wheelchair spaces identified with the ISA, 2 on each side that you can see circled in red, but they are not compliant. Only 2 have a companion seat adjacent, and none are on a compliant accessible route or provide a compliant clear space depth because of the grass panel that is there. 802.1 provides the requirements for wheelchair spaces, which includes being level and have no level changes. The width requirement for spaces is 36 inches wide if there is one space, or if there are two wheelchair spaces side by side, they're allowed to be 33 inches wide each. 802.1.3 specifies the depth for front or rear entry, which is allowed and required to be 48 inches minimum. If entry is only from the side, that depth must be increased to 60 inches. Note that, as I pointed out earlier, the new building code for accessibility, A117, is going to be increasing the depth for front and rear entry from 48 inches to 54 for new buildings, and it is assumed that's going to be the same for exterior sites. So again, watch for that to come out and be published as you work on making your facilities compliant. 802.1.4 and .5 require wheelchair spaces that join an accessible route and not overlap the route or circulation paths. There are two requirements for lines of sight. One in 802.2.1 over seated spectators, and the other in 802.2.2 for standing spectators. That requires that those wheelchair spaces provide line of sight either over or between the heads of the row in front of them, whether it's sitting or standing. Each wheelchair space is required to provide a companion seat. The companion seat must be aligned next to the adjacent wheelchair space to provide shoulder alignment, which is measured at 36 inches from the front of that 48-inch minimum depth wheelchair clear space. The companion seat must be of equal size, quality, comfort, and amenity as other seats in the immediate area. Companion seats are allowed to be movable, provided that they meet those requirements, and movable seats do provide more flexibility with accessible seating. They just have to be of the same size, quality, comfort, and amenity. The discussion and examples so far have been showing large stadiums, but the requirements are the same at all assembly areas with permanent seating. Bleacher seating is very common at ball diamonds and other sports areas at parks, and they are required to provide the same accessible routes, clear spaces, wheelchair spaces, and companion seats as a large baseball stadium like I have evaluated a couple of different times. If the bleachers are located on a compliant surface, you essentially have two spaces at the end of the bottom row of most benches. And depending on the number of benches and the total number of seats you have on those benches, two may be adequate. It's fairly common, however, for bleachers to not be located on an accessible route or have a compliant surface adjacent that can provide those wheelchair spaces. It's also common to have some assembly areas that don't provide any permanent seating, but rather seating that is removable, as shown here at the small amphitheater. 221.5 requires that where you provide only lawn seating or overflow seating on lawn areas, that those lawn areas be connected to an accessible route. This would allow a wheelchair access and allow them to park where they can adjacent to their companion outside of the accessible route, and their companion would typically bring their own seat if they don't want to sit in the grass. It would also be good practice to provide some wheelchair spaces at the top of this steep hill with room for a companion who could bring their own chair to sit with their person that they were with in a wheelchair. Now let's quickly move on to sport fields and courts as we're getting near the end. Sport fields and courts on exterior recreation sites come in a variety of types, some of which are used for multiple sports. It's important to note that areas of sport activity, meaning that area where the play or practice of sport occurs, is exempt from nearly all requirements, as I mentioned earlier in the building block discussion. Where permanent seating is provided, most sport activity areas are assembly areas and require the wheelchair and companion seats that we just discussed. We already asked the question about whether you need an assisted listening system, and if you're worried about that, I would certainly recommend confirming with the Department of Justice based on your specific site if you want an answer that carries some weight. 221.2.1.4 does provide a requirement that at least one wheelchair space meeting the requirements of 802.1 for either 36-inch width and 48 or 60-inch depth, depending on whether it's front and rear or side entry, be provided in each team or player seating area. That player or team seating area can be a bench, or it could be on a sport field or in a dugout. Earlier, we discussed many of the basic requirements of accessible routes to sport fields and courts. We noted the requirement for court sports in 206.2.12 for at least one accessible route to connect both sides, where, for example, where basketball may be played. This is often done by connecting to the perimeter and having access around the sport activity area boundary. You just need to be sure that if you only have one connection, that you can get from both sides of the court on the court outside of the active play area. The same requirement holds true for tennis and pickleball courts, both of which usually provide an expansive boundary around the actual courts for circulation and access to different courts. But not all provide the required entry gate along an accessible route like the one on the left does not. The real difficulty and common issue that we see is that there are often accessible routes to few, if any, soccer fields in many locations. I mentioned earlier the difficulty of providing a compliant surface accessible route to the perimeter of each field or both sides of the fields, but also the added issue when a field is used for additional sports. Here's another good example on the right. This park has a really nice ballpark that also gets used for soccer and lacrosse. Consider how difficult it would be to provide a path to the soccer field perimeter when it would bisect the ball diamond. Some of these issues are pretty complex, and maybe the soccer field in this situation could be moved so its boundary is more towards the north along the perimeter path. But those are things you need to explore to provide access, and not all of them are going to easily be solved. And it's difficult for an accessibility consultant to fully understand all the needs and uses at some of these types of facilities. And that's why we have those types of hard discussions with clients when we're assisting them. Some large sport complexes, like those with ball fields or soccer, may even have concession stands, which would be required to meet the scoping provisions of 227.3 and technical requirement of 904.4 to have a 36-inch maximum height for that service counter. Any other amenities that you might have at any sport fields or courts would also need to comply with the drinking fountains and trash cans and things that we've already talked about, and ensuring that they have all the reach ranges, operable parts, and clear spaces. All right, last, let's talk very briefly about fishing piers and platforms, since these seem to be getting placed in more and more locations. Like all the amenities we have discussed today, fishing piers and platforms are required by 1005 to connect to a compliant accessible route. Realizing some of the unique aspects of facilities over water, the standards do provide a number of exceptions. The context of fishing piers and platforms varies, with some platforms being connected directly to land with a gangway, and others, like Santa Monica Pier, having a long, wide pier out into the ocean that functions as both a fishing pier and a place for the public to walk and enjoy. The requirements are the same for all types of platforms and piers where fishing is allowed and fishing is often encouraged. First, if there's a gangway that connects that platform to land, it can have a vertical elevation rise of no more than 30 inches maximum for each ramp, and that can also often be permitted to exceed the 1:12 running slope. This is allowed due to fluctuating water levels in many locations and the need to not have fixed gangways or platforms, especially when they get to be extremely long. If there are transition plates connecting sections of gangway, those plates are often steeply sloped to connect those different sections that are often at different elevations, and also allow for variance in changing water elevations. Those transition plates are not required to provide landings at the top and bottom. Finally, where handrails are provided, they are not required to provide extensions like handrails on most other ramps. On the platform area itself, where railings are provided, they must provide a minimum of 25% of the total length of the fishing area at a maximum height of 34 inches for people to have a station that may be fishing from a wheelchair like this gentleman in the photograph. Those low sections of railing need to be dispersed over the entire surface of the platform or pier to account for variations in water depth, perhaps shade, and similar conditions that provide different fishing and comfort positions for the users. Edge protection is required that is at least 2 inches high, or you need to provide a 12-inch deck beyond the edge of the railing. The fishing stations need to be 30 inches in width and provide a minimum of 9-inch toe clearance below the railing. Here again, we have a photo of a gangway that approaches a fishing platform with the blue transition plate and several fishing stations with railings provided. Note that on the platform or pier itself, you need a compliant clear space at each fishing station with frontal approach. And you also need a minimum of one turning space on the platform. Realistically, you need one on each end of all finger piers where you have fishing stations to allow someone in a wheelchair to turn when they want to leave. So we made it with a little very little time to spare, but some time to spare. Before I go to questions, let me give you a few good resources that you should be familiar with. First, I suggest anyone with ADA responsibilities be familiar with the U.S. Department of Justice website at ada.gov. There's a lot of good information on there, and I provided links to the ADA standards that you can get from the PDF of this presentation if you want it, or you can simply go to ada.gov and find the ADA standards under the laws and regulations pull down. They also provide their ADA information, contact information at the top of the homepage. In addition, the website of the U.S. Access Board at access-board.gov is a good resource. You can get the ADA standards from this website as well as find guidance on outdoor developed areas, which, though they're dated May of 2014, still provide some good information for some facilities not covered in the ADA standards, but do apply to federal recreation sites. The Access Board site also has some neat animations that I suggest you check out if you've not been to the site in a while. The animations are at the bottom of the homepage. Both the US DOJ and Access Board sites include contact information for technical assistance, along with an abundance of other information. You can also sign up for email updates on both sites and receive information that's distributed on a variety of ADA topics on a fairly regular basis. Last, the ADA National Network, which consists of 10 regional ADA centers and an ADA Knowledge Translation Center. The regional ADA centers are distributed throughout the U.S. to provide local assistance. The national network includes a lot of really good resources and reference material, and they also do provide training and topic-specific presentations. You can register online to be on their web server, and it doesn't cost anything. They have new webinars each month, and if you do subscribe to their newsletter, you will get monthly notifications of upcoming webinars and other items of interest. So with that, I will look and see if we have any questions. I do see at least one question, and if it's something that I can answer, I will do so. The question is, what is the power receptacle requirements for the park stage performance area? How to determine the location of these receptacles? While ADA does not require power receptacles, however, if they are provided, they must be within reach ranges for users and have a clear space. So typically on a park stage performance area, you would typically probably have them somewhere on the side of the stage away from the public view. That's normally where we see them interior on buildings. You can have additional outlets on the stage, a lot of times in stage areas and auditoriums inside of community centers and whatnot. There are plugs in the floor. Those are below the reach range of 15-inch minimum for a wheelchair user, but there are other, as long as there are other outlets within that same space that are usable, you would still meet the requirements there, and how you place them or how you determine where to put them is really up to you. Just ensure that you provide at least one outlet that is accessible, especially in today's age of electronic equipment and people in wheelchairs needing to, just like everyone else, recharge their phone or their tablet or their laptop or maybe even their battery on their wheelchair. So that is the only question that I see. So I will next move on to our last statement here. So in closing, I do want to acknowledge the U.S. Access Board. They let us use a lot of their photographs, and they have some very unique, good examples of photographs for many of the items. There's also like to thank everyone for their attendance. I do see a couple more questions, and I'll get to those as soon as I get through my closing here. I hope you found today's webinar informational and you have a better understanding of the information that was presented. Again, I do apologize for not being able to cover every type of facility to every nth level of detail. I would like to highlight DLZ's YouTube page, where today's and all of the past webinars that we've presented on ADA topics can be watched. You can either go right there to the DLZ Corporation link that's on the slide, or if you just simply go to YouTube and search for DLZ or DLZ Corporation, you should see our page and just click on videos and it'll show up. As noted, we will be having future webinars on different ADA topics, so watch for those. I'm hoping to do one next month on right-of-way. which may not be exciting for parks. It's quite a divergence from the topic that we have today, but important nonetheless. And if you have any questions, suggestions, feedback, topics for future webinars you would like to see, please don't hesitate to request that. You can see my email address and phone number on the slide. Don't hesitate to send me questions directly. If I am not able to get to your question or you weren't able to get it in on time, I'll do what I can to help. There may be an online survey invite sent to you after today's webinar, and we would ask that you complete that to help us make our webinars better in the future. So again, thanks for attending and continue to watch for announcements. And I will look at these other questions here. I have a question here. Have you ever seen or come across a handicap accessible sled hill? Sled hills would be a very difficult thing to provide accessibility to. However, I think if you look at the requirements of scoping, at a minimum, you would need to provide an accessible route to the area where the sleds would be provided. If someone had to bring their own slides, I think that it would be a little different situation. But I know many larger ski resorts, for example, provide tow ropes and inner tubes quite oftentimes. And it's very possible that someone with a mobility impairment, disability could utilize that type of access. It's not common, but I think that you could provide an accessible sled hill. It may just be a little bit difficult to make it fully compliant, depending on what the specific limitations of each individual user would be. I will provide a copy of the slides. We will provide a PDF, and I believe our marketing staff, if you can see Ashley on the slide, Ashley will be assisting me in getting this together. I do need to go through and make it accessible, but if you do, as I mentioned earlier, need a fully accessible version of the PowerPoint slides in PDF or an alternate format, please just let us know. We're happy to do that for you. And if you have any needs for assistance with your ADA compliance program, we do this all the time. This is nearly all of what we do on my end here, and we love traveling and seeing and meeting and greeting with a lot of the folks here, including many of you who are on this presentation, our current or past clients. So again, thanks for attending. That's the end of the questions, and continue to watch for the announcement for our next webinar and save the date. So have a great day, and thanks again.